welcome back to the YouTube channel, and today I'm going to be talking about the history of horror movies. So, yeah. So, the very first horror movie, although it wasn't originally intended to be scary, it did unsettle the audience a little, and it was Le Manoir du Diable by Georges Méliès in 1898, but it was lost until 1977 when they found it again. So in the 1900s to the 1920s, cinematographers were really struggling to find their feet in this new genre of movies. So the first thing they did is turn to literary pieces for inspiration, mainly Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and The Werewolf. After this era of mediocre movies, we move into the 1920s and the 1930s, where lots of what are now considered classics were born. This decade can be split into two parts, the silent movies and the ones with sound. Some of the most iconic silent films from that era are The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu in 1922. The latter of these two films is rated on Rotten Tomatoes as the second best horror movie. These two films were the first movies to really make an attempt to scare the audience. Another monumental occurrence in the 80s was that the word horror was really beginning to be utilized to describe the genre. According to the New York Film Academy, before the 30s, horror was really just romance melodrama with a dark element. Going into the 40s and 50s, Alfred Hitchcock single-handedly established the slasher genre, which didn't explode until later years. The staple of this time period was strongly influenced by the war in Europe and the fear of nuclear bombings. More specifically, movies based around the idea of genetic mutation and invasion were popular. The ones of note are The Incredible Shrinking Man, Godzilla, The War of the Worlds, and When Worlds Collide. The previous two were big hits in 1953. Once we reached the 60s, nothing was out of the picture. Paid actors and actresses fainting in the audience, electric zappers established in the seats, 3D glasses, the list goes on. The popularity of the interactivity in horror genre oozed into other films, but the expenses were too much to keep up, and eventually they had to shut it down. Because of the sudden drop in income, films based around fear became lower budget. As the late 60s encroached, the American appetite for gore emerged, bringing around a rise in slasher films that were pumped out, each one the same with slightly different variations. In the 70s and 80s, literature once again became a source for inspiration, and the famous author Stephen King was the main resource. Carrie, The Shining, and Poltergeist were among the most successful. Films based around religious evil were also booming in this decade, with movies filled with haunted houses and small children being possessed by the devil. Think The Exorcist and The Omen. Now that we've reached the 80s, it's time for the slasher genre once more. The idea, although new, became overused quickly, with multiple shows following the typical trope of an antagonist who goes on a killing spree. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1974 really kicked off this particular movie style. It continued, occasionally creating something that would become a classic, even though success was mixed at the time of release. A few examples are Halloween, Friday the 13th, A Nightmare on Elm Street, which was one of the first films that was successful enough to make sequels a commonplace in the horror franchise. The slasher genre slowly lost its novelty as we progress into the 90s, and for a while the terror-filled films were brought to a standstill until 1992, when comedy overtook the horror industry with the movie Brain Dead. Although after this breakthrough, the enterprise slowed down a bit, with occasional successes. As we look into the future, we can only ask if all the options have been explored, or if there's something waiting to be discovered beneath the surface. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, or night, or yes.